Saxon church dating back to the era, but they were built 150 years apart, so they were very old sisters if that happened. It just was the boundary between the two parishes. But to go back to my storyline, we suddenly suffered an invasion in 1942, and that was the friendly invasion of you Americans who came along to help us. Another thing that the family mentioned was your smart uniforms. Your working uniforms seem to be anything goes, and were amazing. But then again, your Class A's was something else. Yes, this is Colonel Story on the right, the group's original CO overseas, and an enlisted man. Now, these uniforms were very smart. Your enlisted man's uniforms are as smart as our officers' uniforms in the British forces, a fact that didn't go unnoticed by the English girls. Station 162 was built by the Americans. The 831st Engineering Battalion arrived in August 1942 and started flattening the land, clearing the woods, and constructing the airfield. My father stood in awe of some of the machinery that was used, ground scrapers that he'd never seen, huge concrete layers. This photograph was taken in March 1943, when you're still training MacDill, and you can see the airfield coming along. My father remembers one conversation he had with one of the engineers. They were bivouacked in tents up in the woods just above the cross runways. And this American said to him, he said, the further up the woods you get, the tougher they get. And I live in the very last tent. In June 1943, the airfield was virtually complete. And on the 24th, a rumour went round that the aircraft would arrive the next day. Everybody expected B-17s. But sure enough, in the afternoon, a formation did arrive over the airfield, but it was the sleek-looking B-26 Marauder. My father was working in a woodyard at Hyonga to the south of the airfield, and he couldn't wait to get up and have a look at the aeroplanes. The first aeroplane he inspected at close quarters was Captain Cadigan's Dunita. He spoke to the crew, looked inside. There was boxes of nylons and gum, to be expected. And ever from that day, he adopted Dunita. The local children adopted an aeroplane, and they would stand at the end of the runways and look for their safe return. And Dunita was Dad's plane. And I grew up longing to see a photograph of Dunita. We had no photographs then. Every book that came out was scanned, but no sign until we started our research. Another aeroplane that took his fancy was Tabasco. I can't think why, but the painting on the tail was very impressive to a 16-year-old of the day. Tabasco went on to fly 166 missions before it was shot down on the 18th of March, 1945. Early in 1944, Dunita disappeared. We never did find out for a long while what happened to her. And shortly thereafter, Dunita II arrived. So obviously the crew was okay, and something must have happened to the aeroplane. We subsequently learned that the original Dunita was transferred to the Pathfinders and flew missions with those. So I researched the Pathfinder Squadron records and discovered that Dunita herself survived the war, as did Dunita II, here seen in a rare colour picture. And that Dunita came back to lead the group on 6 occasions, 4 of which saw both Dunitas in the same formation, which is rather unusual, I think, and both aircraft flew more than 100 missions before the end of the war. But it's not just about aeroplanes, it's about people. My family, my grandmother, used to take in sewing and laundry to supplement their income at that time. A good source of extra income in the country. And some of the Americans that visited my grandmother's house were Lieutenant Paul Edelman of the 556 Squadron. He was a pilot. I believe he injured his back in a crash landing on the 30th of April, 44. He continued flying, but then got invalidated back shortly thereafter. Another visitor was Harry Taylor. Now, Harry, I know, is with us tonight. It's a great pleasure to meet him again. And he's seen here on the far right dancing with a young lady at the Officers Club on the station. Harry liked his dancing, and we weren't aware we had a photograph of him until he visited with my father and was going through our albums and said, "Hey, that's me." On the left is the RAF liaison officer that served at Willingale as well. Other people known to the group, known to the family, was Sergeant Stankiewicz. Him and Corporal O'Malley were part of the headquarters, and they had spent Christmas 1943 at my father's house and my grandmother's, along with Lieutenant Henry C. Patrick III. Pat, as he was known to everybody, was very close to the family. My grandmother, treated him as a third son. He called her his English mum. Very close. Sadly, Pat was killed in a crash on the 27th of April, 1944, quite near where I live now. There was a test hop that went wrong, and he's buried at Madingley near Cambridge in England. And my grandmother and his mother liaised for quite some years after the war. It was that picture of Patrick that spurred us to find, I wanted to know more. I wanted to find out more, so we decided to try and get the group records. These are held at Maxwell Air Force Base on microfilm. There's about 1,800 frames to each microfilm, and there's 8 films that cover the history of the 387th Bomb Group. That's probably quite lucky, because the 386th Bomb Group, where I live now, there was a test hop that went wrong, and he's buried at Madingley near Cambridge in England. And my grandmother and his mother liaised for quite some years after the war. It was that picture of Patrick that spurred us to find, I wanted to know more. I wanted to find out more, so we decided to try and get the group records. These are held at Maxwell Air Force Base on microfilm. There's about 1,800 frames to each microfilm, and there's 8 films that cover the history of the 387th Bomb Group. That's probably quite lucky, because the 386th Bomb Group has 40 reels, and that will be one heck of a lot of work. The only problem with only having 8 microfilms, whilst it sounds like an awful lot of pages, there's an awful lot of gaps, and a lot of missing points, which we had to try and fill in. That is me. Those clothes were fashionable once. Not necessarily when I was wearing them, but they were fashionable once. I said to Dad one day, I wonder if there's anything we could find of a B-26 Marauder remaining at Willingale. He was very sceptical. We went over and had a search round, and in a deep patch of nettles, I stepped upon this piece of metal, which turned out to be a propeller cuff from a Marauder. Another thing we tried to do is trace all the aircraft nicknames and serial numbers used by the group. And there's one that has eluded us, and it's the second aircraft in line. We know it's called Snake Eyes. My father remembers the aeroplane, and that is the aeroplane we can see the dice on the nose, but we've never been able to trace it. From my own research, I think it's an aircraft of the 559th Squadron that had another name on the opposite side. But this is an appeal. If anyone can give us any information, please let us know. We would love to tie down Snake Eyes. Oh, sorry, I missed myself there. The 2 churches in Willingale, side by side. The nearest one is the Anglo-Saxon church, dating back to the year 800, St. Andrews, which you Americans used during the war. The one to the right is a Norman church. And the reason we have 2 churches is not what folklore would have you believe, and that is that 2 sisters had a row, and that they each had their own church built so they wouldn't have to see each other. But they were built 150 years apart, so they were very old sisters if that happened. It just was the boundary between the 2 parishes. But to go back to my storyline, we suddenly suffered an invasion in 1942.